Good morning, and thanks for joining us. I'm Sarah Allen. The meeting of the Legislative Audit Commission's Evaluation Subcommittee is about to get underway. We'll bring it all live to you, but first, some background information on Legislative Auditor Jim Nobles and his office. Within the Centennial Building of the Capitol Complex, there is an office that acts as a public watchdog. Jim Nobles has been steering the Legislative Auditor's Office for more than 30 years.
I often say that what we do really goes to the deep roots of who we are as a democracy, and that is accountability.
Not to be confused with the state auditor who audits local government and is an elected position. The legislative auditor audits state government.
The legislative auditor is appointed by the Legislative Audit Commission, and it is a bipartisan commission. It's 12 members of the legislature, 6 from the House, 6 from the Senate, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats.
The Legislative Audit Commission also selects the programs the Office of the Legislative Auditor evaluates. Nobles explains it this way.
Every year we ask all legislators to give us suggestions of what they think needs to be evaluated. And then we work with the Legislative Audit Commission and a subcommittee of that commission to narrow that down. We often get as many as 100 suggestions. And we have to narrow that down, usually to about 15 or so, and then we take that number and put it on a sheet of paper and ask all legislators again to tell us which among these they would like us to evaluate. And then the commission selects about 6 or 8 from that list.
Nobles says his office evaluates a wide array of topics, from transportation to healthcare issues to forest management.
We absolutely have to be nonpartisan. We have to be objective in our work, and we have to be accurate. We have to meet those standards in every sentence that we write.
His office digs deep into the management and effectiveness of programs, releasing reports that can be more than 100 pages long.
We can recommend anything that we can think will solve a problem. So there's really no restriction. We often make recommendations to the agency. In fact, I would say most of our recommendations are to agencies to make improvements, but sometimes we make recommendations to the legislature.
The office reports its findings to Legislative Audit Commission. From there, information gets funneled to Legislative Committee with jurisdiction over a certain area, and it is up to that committee to follow up on the findings.
The Legislative Audit Commission sees itself as commissioning evaluations of programs that are of concern and interest to legislators, but not then taking over that responsibility of following up on the recommendations and the findings. But really, what they are trying to provide is information to the Transportation Committee or the committee with jurisdiction over health programs or human service programs or whatever those programs are, and really respect their expertise and jurisdiction to follow up on our reports.
The Office of the Legislative Auditor doesn't just work for the legislature. Nobles says he answers calls daily from members of the public.
When the public has a headline that says something has gone wrong, something is amiss, data has been inappropriately released, or money has been misspent, they want to know who's going to look into that and who's going to give them the unvarnished facts about what happened, regardless of party affiliation, regardless of any affiliation at all. There is going to be an independent, professional, nonpartisan, in-depth examination, and the facts are going to be presented.
No matter if the Office of the Legislative Auditor is working on behalf of the legislature or public, it always strives to adhere to a strict policy of nonpartisanship and confidentiality. Today, Legislative Auditor Jim Nobles is releasing a report on MnDOT noise barriers. Let's now go live to room 200 for the committee meeting already live in progress.
We'll talk about 4 main topics today: federal projects, state projects, maintenance, and MnDOT's decision-making process. We have recommendations for MnDOT in each of these topic areas. And let me quickly clarify the distinction that I'm making between federal projects and state projects. On federal projects, The noise barriers are associated with a larger construction project, such as the Cayuga Street project being constructed on Interstate 35E north of here. If the project meets certain criteria, then federal regulations kick in, and noise barriers must be constructed. And noise barriers may be constructed. Because the need for noise barriers is tied to the specific characteristics of a project, the amount of money spent to build noise barriers on federal projects varies a lot from year to year depending on whether MnDOT projects have major noise impacts. MnDOT spent $30 million in the past 6 years on new noise barriers on federal projects, but I want to clarify that that's not a constant rate of spending. That $30 million includes money from all sources. Most of it is, in fact, federal money. MnDOT also has a small state noise barrier program. These barriers are simply built along existing highways with existing loud noise levels. There is no associated larger construction project. And because it's a state program, federal regulations do not apply, and there's no federal money. The state program has an annual budget, and so that's a more constant rate of spending. Page 13 of the report has a chart that gives more information about the two types of projects. Now, I'll back up and provide some background information. As you may know, sound is measured in decibels, and decibels are a logarithmic unit. For a 10 decibel increase in sound, the sound becomes twice as loud. So 60 decibels is twice as loud as 50 decibels, and 70 decibels is twice as loud as 60 decibels. Noise barriers usually reduce traffic noise levels by 5 to 10 decibels, so they can cut the noise in half in the best circumstances. Barriers can be built from many types of materials. The cheapest and most effective barriers are tall earthen berms or hills, but there usually is not enough space for those, so most barriers are walls, as in the picture on the slide. And let me note two common misconceptions about noise. More traffic means more noise, but it's not a straightforward relationship. For example, doubling the amount of traffic without changing speed does not double the noise. In fact, the increase is only slightly perceptible to most people. If the speed and the proportion of trucks stay the same, it takes a huge increase in traffic, perhaps 10 times the previous level, to double the amount of noise. Also, planting vegetation does not effectively reduce noise. More hedges and trees may be a good thing for a lot of reasons, but reducing noise is not really one of them. So with that basic information covered, let's start with federal projects. As I said, noise barriers on federal projects are tied to larger construction projects. If a project receives federal funds or requires federal approval, federal regulations require MnDOT to do a noise analysis. If the analysis finds that noise levels after the project is built will exceed standards in some locations, then MnDOT has to assess whether it would be appropriate to build noise barriers in those areas. The criteria for whether or not a barrier will be built are set by each state with federal approval. These criteria include such things as the amount of noise that will be reduced, the cost per residence, the number of residences involved, and how much support will be required from the people directly affected by the barrier. Because each state sets its own criteria, some states build more barriers than others. A few states set their criteria so strictly that they don't build any noise barriers at all. Others, like Minnesota, have set criteria that are easier to meet and build a lot of barriers. The map on the slide shows noise barrier building by states over a 15-year period, with the states that build more barriers shaded in darker colors. Minnesota ranked 7th in the miles of noise barriers built over that time, adjusting for federal highway spending levels. Further, we did a careful comparison of MnDOT's noise policy with the policies of 9 states that we chose. We found that Minnesota would build some barriers that each of these other states would not. There are 2 reasons for this. One is that Minnesota has its own separate state noise standards set by MPCA that are stricter than the federal standards. California is the only other state to have its own noise standards. All the other states use the federal standard. So there are some noise levels that other states would view as acceptable and therefore not needing a barrier, but that Minnesota would view as too loud. The second reason is because of choices MnDOT made or has made in setting its criteria. For example, MnDOT sets a higher cost threshold, which means it will build walls that other states would deem too expensive. Another area where MnDOT's policy differs from that of other states is in how it assesses public support for noise barriers. Federal regulations require that states determine the views of property owners and residents who are close enough to a proposed wall that their noise level would go down. But exactly how to do that is left up to the individual states. For most states, the default action is not to build a wall unless property owners and residents want it. Minnesota is one of the few states that does it the other way around. It defaults to building the wall unless there is enough opposition to stop it. Further, MnDOT's vote counting method assumes that anyone who does not vote wants a wall, which basically requires opponents of a wall to build a supermajority in order to defeat it. This approach that MnDOT has taken is a state choice. It is not required by federal regulations, and it is not the approach that is taken by most other states. Counting the non-votes in favor of a barrier can have a dramatic impact. Counting the non-votes as votes in favor of a barrier can have a dramatic impact in some cases. Here are three recent noise barrier votes up on the slide. 2 for walls associated with a project to build a new entrance ramp on Interstate 35W in Minneapolis, and 1 for a project to reconstruct a pair of interchanges on Highway 100 in St. Louis Park. The first column is the overall turnout. The second is the percentage of votes actually cast opposing the wall. And the third column is the percentage that MnDOT counted as opposing the wall after taking into account the individuals that did not vote. As you can see, the non-votes can make a big difference. For the 2 walls in Interstate 35W, opponents just managed to defeat the walls despite overwhelming opposition among those voting. In our view, this method of vote counting may not accurately reflect the preferences of the people affected by a proposed barrier. Since MnDOT instituted this policy in 2011, the average turnout in noise barrier votes has been 60%, so non-votes are usually a substantial portion of the total. We recommend that MnDOT change its voting procedure to one that does not have the effect of counting non-votes as votes in favor of a barrier. Now I'll turn to projects built under the state program. It's a small program, only $2 million per year. And as I mentioned earlier, this program builds barriers on existing highways where there is no associated larger highway construction project. Because it's a state program, it does not have to follow federal regulations. The program is run out of MnDOT's Metro District, which administers MnDOT activities in the 8 counties highlighted on the map on the slide, and it is funded by Metro District out of funds allocated to districts for district-level priorities. For that reason, barriers built under the state's program are built only in the Metro District. These state-funded barriers are built on locations where noise levels currently exceed state standards. MnDOT ranks potential locations that might get state-funded barrier on a priority list. There are a lot of locations in the metro area where noise is a problem, so the list is very long. There are currently 284 locations on the list. MnDOT has built 8 state-funded noise barriers in the past 6 years under this program, so it takes a very long time to move up the list. We took a close look at MnDOT's priority list and its method of ranking and found some problems with the way that it's ordered. I'm not going to walk through exactly how the formula works because it's complicated, but I want to talk about some of the strange outcomes that the formula produces. The formula is based on 3 key measurements: the estimated amount of noise, housing density, and a cost factor. As in the chart on the slide, we found some locations with very similar characteristics that had very different ranks. We show 2 locations here that are on the priority list, one in Minneapolis and one in Roseville. As you can see, they have virtually the same amount of noise, just about the same number of residences per half mile, and the Roseville location has a slightly lower cost factor. In our view, these locations ought to be pretty much right next to each other on the list, yet the Roseville location ranks 21 places lower, which translates into a likely wait of at least a dozen years longer. The reason is because of the difference in estimated noise level. That 70.5 in Minneapolis, 70.5 decibels, is just above the cutoff point, and the 70.0 decibels in Roseville is just below the cutoff. And that difference is enough to force the Roseville location to wait much longer for a barrier. We show some other examples of that in the report, and I I will grab that page number here. That's on page 31.
Mr. Kirchner.
Yes,
So this slide, this is on creating a new barrier,
that's correct.
not routine maintenance and repair of
That's correct.
existing barriers.
Right. This is a location that these are two locations that have no barriers currently that are on the priority list to get a noise barrier when they get to the top of that list, assuming that there is local approval at that point.
Okay.
This approach of using a cutoff in the formula also affects areas with very loud noise. On this slide, we have a chart that shows the decibel levels of the first 75 locations on the list. And you can see that there are some locations with very loud noise that are pretty far down the list. They fall above that same cutoff. That is, locations with noise levels of 76 or 77 decibels are grouped together with locations with just 70.5 or 71 decibels. Now, they are also lower down the list because they have fewer residences or greater cost. But we thought that the formula ought to weight those locations with very loud noise. And in some instances, this noise level is twice as loud as the state's standard, maximum standard. We thought it ought to weight those locations more heavily than locations with less noise. And the formula that MnDOT uses does not do so consistently. And lastly, we also found two spreadsheet math errors in the MnDOT's ranking formula that affected the rankings of many locations, though usually the misranking was only one or two places. So we have two recommendations from MnDOT regarding the state program. First, we think that MnDOT should revise its ranking methodology to address the concerns that we raise in the report. Second, we disagreed with MnDOT's choice to make this program available only in the metropolitan area. Most areas with loud traffic noise are in the metro area, but there are a few places in greater Minnesota that also have loud noise. For example, the picture on the slide is from Avon, Minnesota, in Stearns County. You can see how close the houses are to the highway there. But this location is not eligible to get on the priority list and receive a state-funded noise barrier because it's not in the metropolitan area. In our view, traffic noise is a negative environmental outcome that results from MnDOT's construction activities. And MnDOT is spending state money to address that negative outcome. And we think that funding should be equally available to communities outside the metropolitan area if their noise levels and housing density and cost are comparable to locations in the metropolitan area that are currently eligible. Now I want to move over to the maintenance of noise walls. We talked to MnDOT about its noise wall maintenance program and found basically that there isn't one. MnDOT prioritizes repairs that affect public safety, and noise barrier problems don't usually rank very high on that criterion. Noise barrier repairs are generally crowded out by other, more important maintenance projects. In fact, MnDOT has paid so little attention to noise barrier maintenance that it has not kept track of where else noise barriers are. However, MnDOT maintenance administrators are aware that they have been neglecting noise barriers, and last year, MnDOT did a comprehensive study of its older noise barriers to see how serious problems were. That study found that generally, older noise barriers were actually in pretty good condition. However, there were some that had problems, as you can see from the picture on the slide. We looked at the data from the study and noted that there seemed to be clusters of problems in certain locations, as shown on the map on the slide there. If these are the walls that you drive by every day, you might be led to think that noise barriers are in bad shape all across the metropolitan area. But the comprehensive look that MnDOT did last year shows that these clusters are actually not representative. Still, there are issues there that should be addressed. Because of a canceled state noise barrier project, MnDOT was able to divert some money to address the most urgent problems that study found. However, there is no dedicated funding for noise barrier maintenance going forward. Even though the study that MnDOT did last year shows that there is no immediate crisis, we think that MnDOT can do a little more on noise barrier maintenance. In particular, we found it somewhat odd that MnDOT can set aside money every year to build new noise barriers, but cannot set aside any money to preserve the barriers that they already have. Many of you may remember our report a few years ago on state highways and bridges, where we also expressed concern about the balance between building new infrastructure and maintaining existing infrastructure. We recommend that MnDOT develop some long-term maintenance schedules and funding plans for maintaining noise barriers. One option, for example, might be to take that $2 million that goes each year toward new noise barriers, and every 5 years or so, put some or all of that toward maintenance needs. Lastly, we have a few comments on MnDOT's decision-making process on noise barriers as a whole. We found that the way that MnDOT has developed its policy has not ensured that all interests at the table. Now, I want to give MnDOT some credit here. They have made a point of bringing in local government engineers into their policy development process, and that effort to involve local governments is very unusual among the states. So we give credit to MnDOT for that. However, we still think the process could be even more transparent, and there could be more opportunities for public involvement. Also, we found that MnDOT has not always documented the reasons for some of its decisions, and sometimes decisions made long ago are left in place without a clear rationale. One example of this is that since the 1970s, MnDOT has built most of its noise barriers out of wood. We were told that the decision to use wood has been based primarily on cost, but when we looked for how that analysis was done and how often it has been revisited, we really didn't find any analysis. As far as we can make out, MnDOT has never formally evaluated the cost of wood as compared to other materials, and has not, for example, analyzed whether it might make more sense to use other materials that might cost more upfront, but perhaps last longer. As we show on the slide, most states are making different choices. Over a recent 5-year period, Minnesota built all of its walls using wood, while all other states combined built only 1% of their walls using wood. Now, we did not find strong evidence to suggest that wood is the wrong option. It may, in fact, be the best choice for noise barriers in Minnesota. But we did come away thinking that MnDOT hasn't really made a persuasive case for that policy choice. Overall, we made a broad recommendation that MnDOT should increase transparency, both in terms of bringing more stakeholders into the policymaking process and in terms of documenting the reasons for the policy choices. So that about concludes my presentation. In summary, we think that MnDOT can make some improvements. On federal projects, it should change its voting process. For state projects, it should revise its voting methodology, its ranking methodology, and it should develop a way for greater Minnesota locations to become eligible for the state program. MnDOT should pay more attention to maintenance than it is currently doing. And lastly, it should increase the transparency of its decision-making process. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Chairman.
Senator Metzen.
Yeah, thank you. A good presentation. It seems like that $2 million is very inadequate. If we're waiting 7, 8, 9 years to build a project, and also for maintenance and repairs. I suppose it's not your situation to advise us. I guess that's our thing to do is get the money. It seems to me we have to enhance the $2 million.
Yeah.
If we're waiting 7, 8 years for good projects to be done, $2 million doesn't go very far.
Yeah. There is, as far as I understand, there is no specific legislative appropriation. That $2 million is money that MnDOT discretionarily chooses to put toward this state noise barrier program. It's certainly the legislature could choose to put more money into that pot.
Mr. Chairman, out our way, Dakota County, there's these existing walls that are 50, 60 years old. And you say that a lot of them are in good repair. Out where Representative Hanson and I come from, they're not in good repair.
Yes.
So it just seems to me we need to put more resources in this area, new and existing.
Mr. Chair, yes, as I noted, there are some areas that have clusters of noise walls that are in less good repair, and certainly West and South St. Paul on Highway 52 is one of those areas where there are a lot of noise walls that need some maintenance work. At least that was what the study found a year and a half ago. I assume that's still true.
Thank you.
Representative Khan.
Well, we've had some discussion about this at various times. But one of the things that happened was that the House of Representatives in its transportation funding bill put a one-liner in it which said, this wall shall not be built. That was the 35W southeast wall, at least. And we then went through at the end of the conference committee, there was no objection, it passed through the whole House and so forth. At the very end of the conference committee, someone from MnDOT came and said that will jeopardize the federal funding for the process. I don't think they proved that in any way. But we then went through a process which ended up with the same result that that one line did. And I don't understand why the elected representative who has talked to the people in the area and is reflecting the views of the people who are going to vote or is else going to get unelected could not be considered to have an informed opinion on that. And my specific question is, I guess it's to me, what did it cost to then formally do this conclusion which the House did with the expense of putting one line in a bill?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Kahn. I don't have a figure on the cost of the voting itself. However, I will note that the voting was required by federal regulations, and so the state did not have a choice. The voting had to be done, and in order to not do the voting on federal projects like that, that would require a change in federal policy, not just in state policy.
Representative Kahn.
Well, Mr. Chairman, there is federal policy can be changed as well as state policy, and the best way to change it is to challenge it and say that it makes no sense in this. What was particularly egregious about this, and, I feel I had to do a lot more work than I would like to do on something to help along with that bill and so forth. Particularly egregious was that this area went along a set of mainly student housing, so the people, the residents, affected residents in a sense, were all either students who were there temporarily or absentee landlords who couldn't really care. Fortunately, we got to two of the big landlord owners and got them to vote low, and they had a disproportionately highly counted vote in that. But the idea that a no vote meant not voting meant yes, when the obviously sensible thing for anyone who was affected was to not vote, was particularly egregious in going through this process. And there's another, I don't know why all of my efforts used to be made to getting noise walls constructed, and now suddenly that they're being constructed, it's all been transported into stopping them from being constructed. But the other one that was done, which is also a problem, in I-94, close to the St. Paul border, a wall which I have to now make sure I've removed that line from my campaign literature that says I will fight to get that wall built, because it was and I think, I'm a way back physicist, so I don't want to really say that I know as much about this as I may pretend to know. But I think if I had ever seen a diagram of that, I would have said, you can't, if you have two walls facing each other and you build one higher than the existing one, it's going to cause problems. And I think, my knowledge of, and we did have a problem with the MnDOT people saying that there was no such thing as reflected noise, and that actually a certain amount of effort had to be put into proving that that was not true. And then, apparently, when you start looking at solutions for this higher wall facing a lower wall, one of the things you now can't do is just reduce the height of the wall so they're both even, because then that suddenly increases the noise level for the people who just had that wall built. So part of my recommendations would be that, if you're building, and I do remember from the time, and that was one of the first noise walls that was built on the one side of I-94, and there were immediate complaints from the other side, that the side that didn't have a noise wall, that the noise had increased. And so one of the recommendations ought to be that whenever you're building walls around a freeway, you put them on both sides at once, even if the criteria don't seem to quite be met on the other side. Problem is the Mississippi River and railroad tracks come in so that there aren't that many residents. But that we're still having problems with how this wall can be modified, how it can be, what kind of materials can be on it, what's the aesthetic issue. compared to just the, just the noise, the noise softening issue and so forth. And it just seems that the process has just been absolutely terrible. Particularly since I had called for this wall to be built for about maybe close to 30 years and was never told it was being built. So, I first knew it was being built when I saw the construction vehicles there. So somehow this not involving people who clearly had an interest in it and some knowledge about it was an error. And I don't see anything in MnDOT's response that talks about anything like this. And I don't see anything about their, maybe I didn't read it carefully. I don't see anything about the voting process, and except that there's going to be a policy looking at it. So
We are going to hear from MnDOT.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Kirchner?
Well, that's a lot to respond to, I'm afraid.
I know we've had this ongoing conversation too. So
We did look at the walls in Prospect Park. We don't end up talking about it in the report, but we did make sure that we were familiar with that situation. As far as we could make out, MnDOT's expectations about what extra sound might occur, and their estimate that there would not be enough additional sound to cause a problem because of the reflection, is in line with what the recommendations and the literature is in the field. It has occurred to me that since there is in fact a problem, MnDOT has acknowledged a problem, is going to be looking at it. And perhaps MnDOT would like to contribute to the literature and say that, now here's an example of a situation where maybe greater attention should be paid to the reflective noise than the literature would suggest.
Mr. Chairman, I think services and so forth were donated, but the neighborhood was the ones that did have to do those measurements and did show that there was an increase that there was an increase in noise. And part of the problem was the misunderstanding of what happens when you're not building a noise wall with a whole set of single-story suburban houses, but you're building it in a neighborhood that has a hill rising beyond the existing noise and what happens there. But, I know, I was only peripherally involved in it, but I know an enormous amount of work went into proving that there was an increase in noise. And I think that's something that ought to have been evident from the start.
I think MnDOT is here, and we'll
Okay.
then see they're taking notes behind you. And
Yeah, if we want to get into the more technical details of that particular situation, I would defer to some of the MnDOT staff that are here.
Senator Rest.
Thank you. I just want to echo Senator Metzen's dismay at the, at least a seeming lack of maintenance of, in some areas of the sound barriers, and it would seem to me that if the sound barrier funds are discretionary within the department, that the first priority ought to be to make sure the ones that were deemed necessary to be built are kept in kept in a condition that allows them to fulfill the function that they were built for in the first place. And I certainly hope that MnDOT will respond to that. I'd rather see those walls that have been clearly identified as problems that necessitated their being built in the first place to be maintained before they go and build new ones, given that there are federal regulations that require some of them to be built with regard to the federal highways. And I'd be interested in knowing which ones of those are the ones that are not in good repair came about because of state decisions or federal requirements. And then I know in the private briefing I had with you, and maybe you mentioned this before I came in, that the voting was not always the way it is now, and I wonder if you could again, just briefly, if you covered it before, indicate when the voting procedures were changed and under whose authority, because I think Representative Kahn brings up a couple of important points about that, that if it's a state policy, then it's certainly something that should be thought through again.
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Rest, so there are two questions there. The first was on whether or not whether it's the barriers built on federal projects or state projects that have that have the problems. Most of those are going to be barriers built on federal projects simply because the MnDOT started building the state program in 1997, and so those barriers tend to be newer.
In good shape.
Well, they're newer. Some of the ones that are newer are not in the shape that we would like them to be in, but generally speaking, the older noise barriers are more likely to be the ones that have problems than the newer ones. So I suspect it's mostly the ones that are related to federal projects. With regard to the voting, that was a change in federal regulations that came out in 2010, and the states had to update their policies by the middle of 2011. So prior to that,
do you recall what or know what the areas of concern were that led to such an extreme change in the voting procedures at the federal level? There had to have been something that precipitated such a enormous change.
Well, Mr. Kirchner, I think that what you had said is that the federal government had said you need to make a policy by 11, but that the state is the one that decided that it should be a no vote counts as a yes for the barrier. Or not voting counts as a yes for the barrier. Is that correct?
That is correct. But there was a significant change in the federal regulations. Prior to 2010, the federal regulations said that the states should take local opinions into account, but didn't really specify how to do that. When the federal regulations changed in 2010, they said you must solicit the opinions of the people who will be directly affected by the barrier, the property owners and the residents who live in the area where the barrier, a proposed barrier, would actually reduce noise. I have not followed closely why that change was made, but it is my guess, based upon reading of how the regulations are written and the discussion of the feedback regulations were put out in draft form, that it partly had to do with the fact that there were local communities that wanted barriers, but that cities or counties decided not to build them, even though there was loud noise, possibly based on cost or other sorts of reasons. And so the federal government made this specific change and said, no, you can't have somebody else decide for these individuals whether or not they want the barrier. That has to be the decision made by the people who are directly affected and not by somebody else. And Representative Kahn's point notwithstanding, that is what the federal regulations currently are at this time.
And so, Mr. Chair, Mr. Kushner, so the specific policy was something adopted for the way in which, the manner in which the opinions of people directly affected was going to be measured, was something adopted by the state.
That's correct.
And so is that in a regulation? Or how was that policy promulgated?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Rest. That is in the state's noise policy, the MnDOT's noise policy, which is posted on the website, and that was a policy that was developed by MnDOT. And as I said, it did not involve a whole lot of public input. Now, to be fair to MnDOT, they were given a very short time frame by the federal government to get that done. And they did involve local government and local government engineers in developing that policy. But it is always the case that MnDOT could choose to change that policy going forward, and without having that hard deadline from the federal government as to when a change needs to take place, perhaps they could include more stakeholder opinion from different constituencies.
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kushner, this policy did not go through administrative rulemaking.
I
So
don't
it does
believe,
not have the force
Mr.
of law.
Chair, it's under arrest. I don't believe so. Is that right? It didn't go through?
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just
And
point
I
out-
will ask the department for something so controversial, why not? I want to know why not.
Mr. Nobles.
Mr. Chairman, I would point out, too, I think there is an opportunity here for legislators to consider the possibility of directing through a law what that policy ought to be. Now, admittedly, there are some federal parameters around what you can and can't do, but my understanding would be that you could certainly influence by your legislative action whether they count non-votes as yes votes. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you have to completely sit on the sideline here on this issue.
Well, particularly, Mr.
Interesting.
Chairman, Mr. Nobles, particularly since they didn't go through a rulemaking
Correct.
policy, which would have called for public comment and publishing and so forth. I mean, it could have still stayed under the radar, and people could have just, yawned, but nevertheless, it would have been a public notice of how they intended to meet the federal, the change in the federal regulations, and apparently that was not done.
Mr. Chair, Senator Rest, just to note, although we do think that MnDOT could have been more transparent, they were given a total of 6 months by the feds to get their draft policy in, so doing a full administrative rulemaking process would have been somewhat difficult, I would think, under that time frame.
Mr. Nobles, I want to follow up on Senator Metzon's question on funding, because it appears that Mr. Kirchner, on the source of the funding that the Metro District has, is that just trunk highway funds that are distributed out? And is there the opportunity for bonding here for general obligation bonds for the state portion, either for new barriers or for maintenance?
Mr. Chair, I'm actually going to defer that question over to MnDOT to answer that. I believe the answer to both those questions is yes, but I don't feel confident of where I'm at, so I think I would suggest that MnDOT answer that question.
Mr. Chairman, I would go a little further and say I don't see any reason why there could not be bonding for these projects. They are clearly within the constitutional parameters and restrictions on what bond money can be used for, and basically that's infrastructure. And I think there's probably nothing more compelling as infrastructure than our road systems. But so again, I think there is that opportunity.
And then, unless somebody else has a question, I have another question on the slide on the noise, showing the high volume, the high decibel numbers, and just to clarify your bar graph there.
Yeah.
So you may be in a neighborhood that has a very high decibel level, but because it has few residences, you're going to rank lower on the list, taking out cost.
Right. It is a combination of those three things, of the noise level, the number of residences, or I should say the density of residences, so that it's the number of residences per half mile of length of roadway, and the cost factor. So those three things are combined together in the formula. The observation that we made is that because MnDOT kind of groups together a bunch of different noise levels into a category and says that's high, that these very high decibel levels of 77, 76 decibels, which, as I said, is twice as loud as the state standard for daytime noise levels, 4 times as loud as the night standard, incidentally, those are not seen as any greater in the way that the formula is done than noise levels of 70.5 or 71. And we thought that that was a substantial difference between those two levels, and the formula should account for that.
And the decibel levels are based on a period of time, an average, versus, let's say, Jake braking on a hill slope or some other high incident noise issues. I mean, we're dealing with averages here?
Mr. Chair, actually, Minnesota has a somewhat unique way of measuring noise. It's a way that most other states have moved away from. Most states do take a kind of a broader average across like an hour time period. Minnesota focuses on the loudest 6 minutes within the hour that is measured. So yes, a single loud noise like a train whistle or something wouldn't do it, but they're looking at the peak within the loudest hour as the period that they take their sound measurement from.
And Mr. Kirchner, you contacted other states. I want to get back to the wood versus concrete, or in talking with other states, what drives their decisions? If we're at 100% wood construction, which plywood or that deteriorates over time, thus making a maintenance issue, and I know concrete and other things break down as well, but maybe if you could talk about the other states and their approaches and what they do on
Yeah. We talked with 9 other states about the materials that they chose, and as I said, most states use materials besides wood, but there are different reasons for those. Not all of those apply in Minnesota. For some states, in order to get wood, they have to transport it long distances, and so then actually concrete ends up being cheaper for them. And so it's a cost decision. There are other states that have made decisions based upon the wear and tear, and they think that other materials, particularly concrete, do better than wood over time. There was at least one state I spoke with where the person at the Department of Transportation told me that the main reason that their state builds walls out of concrete instead of out of wood is due to the concrete lobby. So there are there were a variety of different reasons, and we didn't feel that we didn't find anything that was particularly pressing that said, oh, this is obvious that every other state has noticed this, that Minnesota hasn't. It may be the case that wood is the best choice for Minnesota, but our observation was we didn't think that MnDOT had really evaluated all the alternatives carefully.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add one quick point, and I think our main recommendation is simply that MnDOT consider in a systematic way what the other options are, but I don't think it's simply a choice between either wood or concrete. I know from looking at maintenance activities at DNR, for example, which has a number of buildings and other kinds of facilities that they build that are subject to a lot of wear and tear from the weather. They use now a good deal of composite materials. You don't find many either concrete or wood, strictly wood picnic benches, for example, in DNR parks. You find composite materials used much more, and I think that's because they will stand up much longer to the wear of the weather.
And if I could, Mr. Chair, one other observation is that Wisconsin, for example, has chosen to build all of its noise barriers out of absorptive materials that actually absorb sound. That's a choice that they make, and there's there's probably a cost associated with doing it that way, but that also has different impacts than if they were to build them out of regular materials.
Senator Metzen.
Mr. Chairman, I draw your attention to page 27 on the funding. If it's concrete, wood, or whatever it is, it says here that at $2 million per year, at the current cost, that amount funds approximately, that those funds approximately do 1 linear mile. 1 linear mile at $2 million. So you can't, I question whether it's 7 or 8 years you wait. It's probably 20 years. If 1 mile, linear mile is $2 million, and all the needs out there, Mr. Chairman. So I think we've got to someday, somehow, figure out a stream of funding to address these serious problems out there. But if it's only 1 mile at $2 million, I mean, you'll never get there.
Senator Liver.
Thank you. I just need a clarification on that $2 million per 1 linear mile. Is that only on one side of the highway, or is that on both sides of the highway?
Mr. Kirchner.
Senator Limmer, that, and Mr. Chair, that is just on one side of the highway. That is one wall. or it could be several walls that are shorter in length.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, we want to see some of these built in our lifetime, so.
And, Mr. Kirchner, you said that vegetation, planting trees is not going to solve the issue. Any other questions for Mr. Nobles or Mr. Kirchner?
Well, one other question. When
Senator.
one puts a barrier on one side of a highway, does that create kind of like an echo chamber? Does it bounce the noise over to the other side of the freeway and impacts that neighborhood even more?
Mr. Kirchner.
Mr. Chair and Senator Limmer, the literature out there suggests that any increase in reflected noise from building a barrier like that should not be perceptible to most people. That is what the literature says. There are definitely people who live next to highways that have had a wall built on the other side of the highway who would disagree with that research. But that is, the literature suggests, and this goes back to what I was saying at in the beginning of my presentation, where doubling the amount of traffic does not actually result in doubling the amount of noise. It's actually only a slightly perceptible increase. Building a wall so that some of the noise bounces over to the other side of the highway represents, not quite a doubling of the noise of the traffic, and the increase is, according to the literature, not particularly noticeable. That is not to say that people don't perceive one.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Limmer.
living in a community that has 3 major freeways intersecting in Maple Grove, I get a lot of information on noise from the freeway, and I would agree with your comment that noise coming from only one side of the freeway, bouncing around, seems like everyone I talk to knows that it magnifies the noise to the neighborhood on the other side. I don't know if it's a perceptual illusion, but nevertheless, it's an issue that we all, as policymakers, have to deal with. So.
Representative Khan.
Well, I'll just point out, probably before you came in, you said in one of the walls that's under discussion, but that's been under discussion in my district. People actually did go with noise experts, put a considerable amount of effort into measuring it, and did discover that there was a perceptible increase in noise.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll hear from MnDOT.
That's not in the literature.
Yeah.
John Shiglow, the Division Director, Engineering. Hopefully I said that. Mr. Shiglow.
Mr. Chair and members, my name is John Chiglow. I'm the Engineering Services Division Director for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Within my division is the Environmental Stewardship Office that manages our noise policy. I will begin by going through each of the recommendations that the State Auditor has made and give you a short response. I think that might address some of the questions that were asked, but then I can follow up with some of the questions that were asked earlier. In terms of recommendation number 1, MnDOT has already started reviewing voting process. This process review would not be final until the Federal Highway Administration approves it, and that's a process that we would need to send to the Washington, D.C. office for their approval. We will establish an advisory committee that will review how other states are performing the voting process. As part of this review, we'll identify best practices from around the country and modify our process accordingly.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rest.
Just on that point, what's to prevent the legislature from directing that policy for you to submit to the federal government?
Mr. Chair and Senator, I'm not aware of anything that would prevent that.
Senator.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, continue. Our process has always favored the building of walls versus not building walls. When you look at, and that was stated in the auditor's report as well, we have always favored the building of walls versus not building of walls as a mitigation to the noise generated from the roadways and traffic. MnDOT was the only state to involve local units of government in our initial process. I know one of the concerns that was earlier brought up was why we didn't go through a rulemaking process. One was the time, but in review of the process, we did engage local units of government to be a part of the development of that process before we submitted it to federal highways, and that we were one of the only states to do that in the nation. In the future, in this next process, our intention is to involve and expand to involve the public, not just the representatives within their cities, but the general public as a part of that process as well. As part of recommendation number 2, expanding our Metro state-funded program, we will assess this possibility. The majority of noise issues are definitely located in the metro area. We will assess this possibility in order to understand the total scope of this type of endeavor, to understand the trade-offs associated with this type of decision in terms of funding. We need to definitely understand what the competing needs are for the funding that is available. And in order to establish a consistent and fair process, it requires us to understand all of the statewide noise issues before we can make the investments in the construction of noise walls outside the metro area. As was stated in the state auditor's report, MnDOT has been monitoring noise levels in the metro area for some time. We have a substantial database that helps us make our decisions, although I understand there are some concerns or some issues that were brought up about how we prioritize those decisions. But in order to really have a fair and consistent process from a statewide perspective, we would need to begin to establish a similar type of noise database that we could use to effectively make those decisions on a fair and consistent process. In terms of recommendation number 3, revising our method for prioritizing the state-funded program, we have an established process and follow it consistently. So we do believe it is fair. Granted, there are always other ways to go about prioritizing the projects, and we can look at those as ways to enhance our program and improve it. We always are aiming for trying to be more transparent in our decisions, and in that the cities and the MPCA have both been engaged and involved in review and development of these policies, both for the state-funded program and the program that was submitted to federal highways for approval. But we do need to engage the general public to add additional transparency to this process. We will review the process and look for ways to enhance our transparency in how we make these decisions, and ultimately how we prioritize the walls in the program. And so we are most definitely interested and willing to pursue those improvements.
Mr. Chico, just kind of following up on what Senator Eston asked on an earlier topic. In the development of that policy, was that just MnDOT working internally to develop that, or did you have an advisory committee of citizens or local government? And how long has that policy been there of having the cost, decibels, and community involvement?
Mr. Chair, the state program you're referring to? My understanding that the legislature asked us in 1995 to perform a noise study, and in 1997 we really established a program to identify and prioritize these processes, or the decisions. And through that process, we've engaged the cities, a select number of cities as part of that committee, and the PCA, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, has also been at the table as well.
Mr. Chairman, what about Met Council?
Yeah.
Did you consult with them?
Mr. Chair and Senator, they are in consultation because it's in the metro area. They are definitely involved in the funding that we use and how we how we identify projects within the metropolitan area. So yes, they are involved as well.
What about in developing the voting policy?
Mr. Chair? No, they were not, Senator, involved in the development of that policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I think in 1997, Senator Betson, that might have been you that had got the study and worked on this. So
I think you're right, yeah. Thank you.
am I right on that, Mr.? They're all nodding their heads for the camera, so it's a good follow-up now, 15 years, to see how this is working. And on that, you've mentioned studies, and I think the legislative auditor had talked about the literature. And so is the University of Minnesota doing any research on this, or is there, I mean, I'm assuming there's probably an association of engineers that you meet and compare notes, or how do you put science or data into this decision-making process?
Mr. Chair and members, there's probably national research and local research. One would potentially be through the Transportation Research Board, or AASHTO, the Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, would potentially also be a part of this. We could hire consultants to help us perform that internally within the state as well, but there would be national and local, I'll just call it state local research that could be done or is being done, I'm sure, on noise.
Well, we don't know. We don't like to have wheel reinvention all the time. So I'm assuming in the 50 states there's folks who have been working on this, even though we're often leaders in it. But to see, particularly on the types of barriers or what the experience is, and in maintenance, particularly, if there's how long do things last before they have to be replaced?
Mr. Chair, that's right. We are through our participation in both the Transportation Research Board and AASHTO. We are very much involved in those organizations to try to learn from what they are doing, as well as us sharing our information with them as well. And so that's one of the bigger benefits of us being involved in those organizations.
Sure. What's the total MnDOT budget with the federal aid for transportation in Minnesota? What's your yearly budget?
Mr. Chair and Senator, are you referring to our overall program
for the hundreds of millions, or
for the biennium?
Biennium is fine. Yep.
It's approximately $4 billion.
$4 billion. And it seems to me that walls are an integral part of the transportation system. Now, out of $4 billion, can we find a little percentage or something going forward? That's probably not the question to you. It's what we have to decide, but maybe it's a quarter of 1%, whatever that amounts to. I don't have my calculator in front of me, but walls are part of the transportation system. And out where I come from, these people are really disturbed in Inver Grove Heights and South St. Paul and West St. Paul because of the noise. And they have their neighborhood meetings. We go to MnDOT and we say, here, we got the city council support, we've got the neighborhood support. Yeah, but you're way down on the list, you'll never see it. So, but again, the $1 million or the $2 million doesn't go very far. And I repeat that walls, in my opinion, are in certain circumstances part of the transportation needs. So maybe there's a little percentage that we set aside. Certainly $2 million doesn't do anything. So that's my...
Representative Kahn.
Well, I know many years ago, I think when Bill Schreiber was the legislative representative for DOT, I got a wall built and a wall repaired by legislative. I don't even know if it took legislative action. I think it maybe just took asking, and it got put into a project that was being done on a highway.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Representative Kahn, that happened in our district way back then. I'd say our people wanted it. We're coming forward, please do it, and they did it back then. Now you're prioritized number 222 for whatever method they use, and you can't ever get there.
Well, and the other question that I had is, can anyone answer the question about what it took to replace the one line I put in the appropriations bill with neighborhood information meetings, a survey, and a vote? Can anyone tell me what the cost of that process was?
Mr. Chiglo?
Mr. Chair and member, no, I'm sorry, we don't have that information.
Is it possible to get that information?
We can try to gather that information, yes.
I mean, you must have it. You must have some way, person hours and, numbers. The amounts of paper that were produced on this were pretty formidable, I believe.
Mr. Chair and yeah, Representative, yes, we'll get you some information, yes.
Maybe that'll pay for Jim's.
But Mr. Chair,
Chairman,
Senator Rusk.
I do think we need to be very careful about making claims of, I got this wall built, or I didn't get this wall built. I think one of the problems that the Department of Transportation has to constantly deal with is, for want of another term, and that's legislative interference to policies of what roads are built, what their long-term plans are, that powerful legislators like Representative Khan can't just come in and say, this needs to happen now, even if it's not in the proper order of barriers that need to be built. I feel a little bit different about the maintenance and repair. I think that should be a priority regardless of the construction, and the barriers along 169 and 100 that are in my district are, as far as I can tell, are in great shape. So I'm not complaining about anything that's in my district, but I really don't think it should be, they should have a process that's correct and accurate, and Mr. Kirshner has shown in some of those there were misnumberings, or this notion of, 70.5 puts you in a go position, and 69.5 puts you in a no-go position. I think that needs to be re-examined, but that should be a policy within the Department of Transportation, not because the legislature, I think the legislature can say how the voting ought to go, but I don't think they should say which walls should be built and which ones shouldn't. And there, so there is a cost for doing that, Representative Khan, but going about that voting, but I don't think that's unreasonable to do it that way myself.
I'm going to go to Senator Limmer.
If I can just weigh in, during the time I've been in the legislature, I found that the competition for transportation money has gotten a little more acute. We've now created kind of like pathways. So much money has to go to transit, so much has to go to rural, so much has to go to the urban areas. And the whole issue of noise barriers are kind of, when you look at the big scheme of things of just moving traffic, it's kind of lower on the priority list. It makes it difficult for metropolitan legislators to represent their communities, because more and more traffic is on those roads, creating many times more noise, and yet there's other legislators that are now wanting and demanding that some of that money go to their districts. And we've got population centers, you've got Rochester, St. Cloud, Duluth, that are all beginning to have the metropolitan noise issues that we have had almost exclusively in the metropolitan area. And so I think it's a question of priority. How much are we really going to dedicate toward the overall transportation budget? And that may have to be at the expense of other things. But priorities should be something that's moving all the time rather than just static. But I think, outside of the chairman, I'm not sure where he represents, but all of us are in the metropolitan areas, so we're probably a little bit more informed on the public reaction to noise on our freeways.
Senator Benson and I go to the same meetings, so.
All right, all right.
Just the Senator Rest left, but I'm not so sure it's interfering if you're an elected official,
No.
like Representative Kahn or whoever it might be, Hanson, Metzen. Is it interfering when you go to bat for your neighborhoods and the people that are meeting in your district, advocating for something? If that's interfering, I guess I'm probably been wrong before, and Senator Representative Kahn has been wrong too, if that's interfering. I think you're advocating for your community and your people.
Representative Kahn.
Well, particularly when the interference is a cost saver, it should be a no-brainer.
Yeah. So,
Mr. Chiglo.
Mr. Chair, members, all the numbers aside, please keep in mind that out of the allocation to the DOT, as Senator Limmer had mentioned, there's a vast distribution of those funds. So not all of those funds are available for the DOT to invest into our infrastructure. On average, we have approximately $1 billion a year in a program to invest. And when you look at our overall state, we manage as a DOT for the state approximately or a little over $10 billion in total asset value. And so we have a lot of competing needs to manage and manage our investments towards. When you look at our pavements and our bridges and all of our other infrastructure that directly affects the safety of the road user, we definitely have to look at trade-offs when we make our decisions. And we try to do the best we can. We're working with this $2 million a year as a starting point. We realize it doesn't go a long ways. We can appreciate the concerns of the residents with the noise walls that are in disrepair. We would definitely like to be able to manage all of our assets to an engineering standard. However, with the current funding that we have, it is not something that is feasible.
Mr. Chiglo, I'm thinking with capital investment with the state colleges and universities and the university, we have HEAPR. We have kind of ongoing maintenance dollars that go in where the legislature is not directing which building to repair, which roof to repair, or which sidewalk to repair. We leave that up to the institution, but we provide them dollars to make sure that ongoing maintenance is occurring. It seems to me here that having some money go for ongoing maintenance, if you don't have the funds right now, if you don't have another source of dollars, that this could be a bondable a capital investment with either general obligation bonds or revenue bonds from fuel. So you have a way of putting money in there, and I'll just ask you directly, if we put $2 million into of bonding money into maintenance, you've done this study, you could pick where you go out and repair walls that are currently falling apart. You could do that, and how quickly could you do it?
Mr. Chair, members, one comment, these are all considered trunk highway elements, and so general obligation bonds would not be able to be used. It would only be trunk highway funds or bonds that could be used. With the bonding that we've done over the last few years, debt service becomes a concern, and we're reaching a threshold of that debt ceiling that we have within the department. But these projects are straightforward. In this year, in 2013, we used the $2 million to address existing walls or maintain existing walls. In 2018, we'll be doing the same thing. I realize, though, that doesn't go a long ways to solving the problem. These projects are fairly straightforward, and they would not take a very long time to deliver, not years, a few months, and I would think that we could deliver that within.
Proceed.
In terms of recommendation number 4, MnDOT appreciates and agrees with the need to maintain and preserve the state's assets, over $10 billion worth of assets. As I mentioned earlier, funding levels do not allow these assets to be maintained at recommended engineering standards. Investments are prioritized by the direct impact on public safety primarily is how we're making our investment decisions. In 2013, I just mentioned that Metro used the $2 million in state funds to maintain or replace existing walls. We've done that. We've already planned for that to happen in 2018 as well. And then, in response to one of the comments, in 2012, the DOT recognized the need to really have an understanding of the conditions of our walls, and we implemented a study in 2012 in recognition of this for the need of a long-term maintenance plan, and that's what we're trying to work through right now with that study. Recommendation number 5, in terms of transparency, we will reconvene the noise policy review group. The first meeting is scheduled to be held by the end of this year. As part of this, we will hold, we'll already started the solicitation process for the consultant to assist us in this process, and we plan on holding meetings with the public to gain that input and feedback from them on this policy. In terms of noise wall material, it's primarily cost-driven. Based on our history, we believe wood noise walls have been the most cost-effective way to build these walls, and so we've used wood primarily because we can build more walls for the dollar, and that has been the primary reason for building noise walls. We will, however, be doing alternate bid projects in 2015 and 16 where we design a wood or concrete or an alternative type system to allow the competition of the industry to determine what noise wall is actually most cost effective. And those two projects will be occurring in 2015 and 16. In closing, we want to thank the Office of Legislative Audit for helping us clarify issues in support of a more consistent implementation of our policy. We generally agree with the recommendations of the report, and we truly do look forward to working with the communities and the public and the elected officials in trying to improve and enhance this process.
Thank you. Any questions for MnDOT? Any further questions? Thank you. Mr. Nobles?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to note for you and the others that we will be having another report to be released probably in the early part of November on the Sustainable Forest Incentive Act. So that will be your next meeting.
Seeing no further business, the meeting is adjourned.